If we look back on the sphere where spiritual reality first made its appearance, we find that the notion involved was that the utterance of individuality is that which is both in and for itself. But the shape which immediately expressed this notion was the honest consciousness which busied itself with the abstract thing itself. This thing itself was there a predicate. But it is in conscience that it is for the first time a subject which has made explicit all the moments of consciousness within it, and for which all these moments, substantiality in general, external existence, and the essential nature of thought are contained in this certainty of itself. The thing itself has substantiality in general in the ethical sphere, external existence in culture, the self-knowing essentiality of thought in morality. And in conscience, it is the subject that knows these moments within it. While the honest consciousness always seizes merely the empty thing itself, conscience, on the other hand, wins the thing in its fullness, a fullness given to it by conscience itself. Conscience is this power because it knows the moments of consciousness as moments, dominating them as their negative essence. In paragraph 641, Hegel is pausing for a moment to show us, or rather to explain to us, the transition that is taking place here in the morality section, and specifically in this last part of the morality section, which has to do with conscience. And then if you've looked at the title of this, you notice that we're also going to have, the beautiful soul, evil and its forgiveness. We haven't gotten to that content yet, and there's really no hint at this point, I think, that you can see about where those are going to arise. But in the next few paragraphs, we're going to see the beginnings of this. And I guess you could say, the dynamics that we've charted out in the earlier part of this last section of the Spirit portion of the work, in the back and forth between duty and individual and universal, you can see some of that going on. But here we're, again, like I said, taking a moment to sort of consolidate things. And you notice that Hegel is going to tell us something about the previous sections of this entire Spirit portion of the work, the largest portion. He's going to talk about what's going on in the ethical sphere, the very first part, where we're dealing with you could call it culture if you want, although he's going to use a different, he's going to talk about culture later on. We would call it culture in an anthropological sense or sociological sense, where it's something that we have as a background and we're working our way out through it. And then we have the culture section, right? And that has to do with spirit that has become alienated from itself. So it's not culture in the same sense necessarily as that which an ethnographer looking at a group might necessarily describe. It's rather culture as the possibility of standing apart from the ethical substance or the mores that we're used to. And then finally we get into the morality section, right? Where spirit is both alienated and reconciling itself with itself. And, whenever we have these big generalities like we're going to jump into in just a second about spirit, Geist, we should remind ourselves that the way in which spirit moves forward for Hegel and the way in which spirit manifests itself is not only on the sort of grand scheme, big picture sort of scale. It has to happen in terms of individuals who are related to each other in their actions, their passions, their assumptions that they have coming to them from what we typically call culture or their standpoint in history. So that's going to be an important thing to keep in mind. Here we're talking about a particular, we could say, generic individual that we're going to get to in just a moment. Hegel begins this passage by talking about the sphere where spiritual reality first enters in. He says, if we look back on that sphere, or spiritual reality. Here it's first made its appearance. Eintreten, right, is the verb, so it literally steps in or enters or shows up is another way of saying it. Now, what's kind of interesting here from a lexical perspective, very often in translating Hegel into English, we will use the term reality, and that's quite often a translation of the term Wirklichkeit, which can also be actuality. Here, Hegel is not using that term. He's actually using the cognate of English reality, right? Realität. And so it's not the same thing as just actuality. There's something a bit more involved here. What is that? Well, we're going to see in just a moment. So the sphere where this first enters in, the spirit section of the work, what's going on there? He says, we find that the notion or concept, the Begriff involved was what? That the utterance or the expression, the Aussprechen, of individuality, Individualität, is that which is both in and for itself. And here, I've got sort of an equal sign, right? They're an equivalent, sei, right? That these things are the same, or that they equal to each other. And here, it is something in and for itself. But Hegel is expressing it a little bit differently, again, in the German, das an und für sich, right? That which is in and for itself. Something that sort of stands out by having that quality. So that's all very good, right? We've just been seeking over and over again for that which is in and for itself. This Hegelian play between the in itself, the for itself, also the for another. Right? We're always trying to bring them together in a unity, and they're sort of like magnets that we're trying to push together. They repulse each other after a while. The closer we get them. Here now we have a shift. So Hegel says, how does this take place? This occurs through what he calls the shape which immediately expressed this notion, not the only shape possible, right? Definitely not in the culture section or the morality section, but the shape in which this expressed itself was the honest consciousness, the ehrliche Bewusstsein. You could also say the noble consciousness. And we saw that play itself out in culture, where it turned out that the noble and the base consciousness were indeed not exactly the same, but interchangeable. The noble consciousness didn't actually measure up to its own ideals. The base consciousness was what pushed the dialectic forward. We also saw this in the interplay in the ethical portion early on in the work, dealing with the two laws, the law of the society and the law of the family, or the law of the gods, and the people who stand for them. Sometimes, when we had an advancement of spirit, it's because somebody, you might say, instead of just calling it the honest consciousness, let's call it the fully committed consciousness. The consciousness that engages itself with some sort of idea or ideal, which is at the same time a reality, a Wirklichkeit, and it tries to conform itself to that. So Antigone trying to bury her brother is a prime example of this, as is her uncle Creon trying to stand for the city, or the knave and the noble in the interplay in culture between the honest, the noble and the base consciousness, right? The struggle between state power and wealth. It's not individuals who hedge their bets and just only commit a little bit that advance the historical dialectic. It's the ones who really throw themselves into being a certain kind of thing, and they do that on the basis of thinking that what they're doing is best, is the right thing for them, and thereby perhaps also the right thing for others, or at least ought to be respected by others. And then they discover, of course, that things aren't exactly what they seem. They don't quite measure up to what they believed. And then it's time to move on again in the dialectic, right? So the honest consciousness What is the honest consciousness doing? And here Hegel brings in another term that he's been using quite a lot, the Sache selbst, right? And Miller is translating it as the abstract thing itself. Not a bad translation at this point. There's other places within the text where we would want to translate it differently. I've proposed many times calling it the project with a sort of capital T, capital P. What it is that the person is attempting to do. The thing itself, the thing in itself, could be something epistemological that we're trying to track down or something metaphysical. Actually, it is always metaphysical because it's being accorded a sort of reality or Wesen, right, essence, an importance. But it's also something ethical. People orient their theoretical work, and they orient definitely everything else around practical desires, necessities, and Hegel is incredibly attuned to that if you've read through the earlier parts of the Phenomenology. So in trying to figure out what the abstract thing in itself really is, for example, what duty really commands of me, I am engaging as the honest consciousness in something that is going to transform me in finding out what that abstract thing itself is. And he talks about the honest consciousness busying itself with the abstract thing itself. And there he says it was a predicate. Now, you might say, what's all this business about predicate and subject? And here Hegel is being a little bit metaphorical, you know. Is the thing itself literally a predicate? What is a predicate? A predicate is, well, I'm about to give you one. A predicate is something said of something else. That is something said of something else is me predicating that language, that string of words, of the subject, the term predicate. I just explained it to you by displaying, subject, copula, predicate. Ironically, in this case, the predicate was subject, right? And the other string of words was the predicate. Does Hegel mean that the thing itself is predicate in that sense? Not exactly. Hegel likes to use this language of subject and predicate and play off of it and play with it in a lot of different ways. And here he is exhibiting that sort of play. The predicate would be something that is dependent upon the subject. That's an important part of it. And one of the things that you're going to see Hegel always trying to do is see if we can't get the predicate to somehow be a subject itself. That happens here. So how does this happen? Well, he talks about what's going on in this thing itself. He says, the thing itself is a predicate. It's in conscience that it is, for the first time, a subject. How? Because it has made explicit all the moments of consciousness within it, and for which all these moments, what are these moments? Substantiality in general, substantiality itself, right? External existence or external being, and self-knowing essentiality of thought. A little bit later, he's going to frame that a little bit differently, but it's still the same general idea. And we're going to come to that, and we're going to look at each of these in turn. Each of these are moments, or, think of them as not quite parts, but interconnected components of the whole that is the abstract thing itself. And each of these has been charted out in a previous dialectical development that Hegel has charted out and can associate with the different sections of spirit. Isn't that convenient that the work falls into, a structure like that? So we have the ethical sphere, we have culture, and we have morality. Not the entire morality section, but the morality section up to this point with the two previous subsections. Because conscience is going to be doing something different. It is providing a subjectivity to this otherwise predicate of the thing itself. So he says, the thing itself has substantiality in general in the ethical sphere. Substantialität überhaupt, right? Substantiality as such, you could say. It also has external existence, äußeres Dasein. Dasein, being there. And, how does it have external existence? Well, there's this estrangement. It is outside of itself. The thing itself finds that it doesn't have its meaning in itself, but rather in its other. And then we have the self-knowing essentiality of thought, Wesen des Denkens, right? And he'll elaborate a little bit on that. He says that it's in the self-knowing essentiality of thought is in morality. But then it's in conscience, this very last section, which is not just a section in the book, but is supposed to be charting out a development of the human being. It is in conscience that it becomes the subject that knows these moments within it. These moments don't know themselves adequately. They did work themselves out, and as actual human beings, they did have their own seeming substantiality and seeming subjectivity. Actually, not seeming subjectivity. They had subjectivity locally that appeared to be global, you could say. Now we have a subject who actually is global in that sense. So he goes on and he says, while the honest consciousness always seizes merely the empty thing itself, and he uses the word leeres there, a void. There's a void there within it, a privation, a not quite being filled. In conscience, it actually grasps, he says, the thing in its fullness. The thing, the abstract thing, becomes concrete. A fullness given to it by conscience itself. Now, here's the last part of it. Conscience is this power because it knows the moments of consciousness as moments, dominating them as their negative essence. It does not treat any single one of these as if it's more than it is. It says you are components within a larger system or structure, and the binding is the conscience. And notice he talks about conscience as negative here. So conscience itself does not yet have a positivity of itself, which it arguably does have in some of the shapes that we're going to look at in a few paragraphs later. When conscience is considered in relation to the single determinations of the antithesis manifest in action and its awareness of the nature of those determinations, its relation to the actual case in which it has to act is, in the first instance, that of knower. Insofar as this knowing has in it the moment of universality, conscientious action requires that the actual case before it should be viewed unrestrictedly in all its bearings, and therefore that all the circumstances of the case should be accurately known and taken into consideration. But this knowing, since it knows the universality as a moment, is at the same time aware that it does not know all the circumstances, or, in other words, that it does not act conscientiously. The genuinely universal and pure relation of knowing would be a relation to something not containing an antithesis, a relation to itself, but action, in virtue of the antithesis it essentially contains, is related to a negative of consciousness, to a reality possessing intrinsic being. Contrasted with the simplicity of pure consciousness with the absolute other or implicit manifoldness, this reality is a plurality of circumstances which breaks up and spreads out endlessly in all directions, backwards into their conditions, sideways into their connections, forward into their consequences. The conscientious mind is aware of this nature of the thing and of its relation to it, and knows that in the case in which it acts, it does not possess that full acquaintance with all the attendant circumstances which is required, and that its pretense of conscientiously weighing all the circumstances is vain. However, this acquaintance with and weighing of all the circumstances are not altogether lacking, but they exist only as a moment, as something which is only for others, and this incomplete knowledge is held by the conscientious mind to be sufficient and complete because it is its own knowledge. In paragraph 642, we find that there is something going on with conscience that results in when it moves away from being a sort of pure knowing and engages in action, which it has to do, it becomes less conscientious or even sufficiently unconscientious that its very status as conscience gets called into question, as we're going to see a little bit later on. Right now, Hegel's just sort of setting out the problematic. And some of the elements of this are not unfamiliar to those who have traversed the phenomenology up to this point, especially some of the antitheses that are involved in action or comportment. You might say, another way to translate Handeln, a sort of continual way of behaving, not just a single act necessarily, but a set of actions that are meaningful and committed. So there is an antithesis in action, and that it's always got to be conditioned by the circumstances. Here, Hegel's framing it in terms of knowledge, and in terms of practical knowledge, and in terms of the kind of practical knowledge that is Gewissen or conscience, right? Which is supposed to be, getting us to a new stage of the dialectic. It's supposed to be universal. This is supposed to be the answer to a lot of our questions up until this point. So he says, when we're considering conscience in relation to single determinations of the antithesis, the Gegensatz, manifest in action, and its awareness of the nature of these determinations, the ways in which action is actually determined, its relation to the actual case, in German, the Wirklichkeit des Falles. So Falles case, the way something is, right? It's really a cognate to the Latin causum that we have for case, right? Wirklichkeit, actuality, reality, what the thing is. So here we're talking not just about the case itself, but what happens to be the case. What is the case? We have to act never in a pure, sort of abstract, never land, the realm of theory. Maybe a lot of what we do in ethics classes is like that. We have these abstract trolley problems. You never actually get put into a trolley problem. You always get put into something that's a lot messier and not quite so clean in its contours. And there's epistemological problems of, well, do I actually know all of the conditions involved in this case? And the answer is usually, I don't know if I do or not. It's not just, no, I don't know everything that's involved. This is a little bit of a side topic, we are often ignorant of the level or the range of the ignorance that we are suffering under. But we do, if we're being honest with ourselves, know that we don't know everything. So the knower is dealing with an actual case, and they're trying to act in relation to that actual case. So it says the way in which conscious is understanding itself is that of knower. Now we're going to look at that. We're going to analyze this conception. Do I actually know enough? He says, insofar as this knowing has in it the moment of universality, insofar as somebody who's acting in good conscience, we're not just supposed to be like acting according to our whims. We're supposed to be doing something universal, not necessarily with Kantian universality, where we have to will at the same time. It can be a universal law of nature covering everybody, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a sort of universality there. If I say I should do things this way, somebody else can ask me, well, why the hell did you do it that way? And I should give them answers, and they say, oh, yeah, I should have done the same thing myself in those circumstances. Not, oh, man, you are totally off base. I would have done it differently, and here's where the universal is. So he goes on and he says, conscientious action, right? Action that is being done in accordance with conscience requires that the actual case before it should be viewed unrestrictedly, literally without being hemmed in, umschrankte, right? Not being sort of artificially restricted, you might say, or treated reductionistically, right? We should look at it in all the circumstances of the case should be accurately known and taken into consideration. So, if we've got some sort of judicial action that we have to take, We should find out not just, did that person do that sort of thing and read the police report and maybe call a few witnesses. We should look into it and see what exactly was going on. What's the background of these people? What were the circumstances that were happening? Then we can come to a fully informed decision. Or if we're deciding about our own, career path, we should do the research and figure out, would this actually be the right thing for me to do? Is it the right thing in terms of it's going to be financially beneficial to me? Or is it the right thing in terms of I'm going to be helping other people that otherwise wouldn't be helped by the use of my talents and capacities? Or, we could think of all sorts of other circumstances. We should take in the totality of everything so that we can act conscientiously, right? In accordance with conscience does not mean just following a rule or listening to a vague voice in your head. It means doing your due diligence. Here's where it gets tough, though, right? We can't always do that, can we? Especially when we have to act. Action, by its very nature, is not just a matter of dealing with particulars. It's a matter of never having fully enough time to investigate everything. So he says, this knowing, the knowing of conscience, because it knows the universality as a moment, is aware it does not know all the circumstances, or in other words, that it does not act conscientiously. Now, is Hegel saying, I see everyone's full of it, nobody's conscientious? He's not saying that. He's not saying, by the way, that this automatically derails the ethical project and nobody can ever live up to conscience. He's just saying if you're really conscientious, you are going beyond the, you might say, superficially conscientious person because you realize that you're not being fully conscientious, right? You're not taking account of everything because you don't have that as a possibility. And so there's a certain unconscientiousness in the heart of being conscientious in terms of action. So he goes on and he says the universal and pure relation of knowing would be a relation to something, and here's where the text gets a little bit tricky. I understand why Miller's translating it the way he is, but there's two uses of the word antithesis following upon each other in this passage. And they're not exactly the same term, but they are closely connected. So he talks, let me actually just read the passage to you, and then we'll talk about how these are slightly different but connected. He says, the genuinely universal pure relation of knowing would be a relation to something not containing an antithesis, a relation to itself. But action, in virtue of the antithesis it essentially contains, is related to a negative of consciousness, to a reality possessing intrinsic being. So action, as we've seen, we've talked about this plenty in previous passages in not just the spirit section, but also in the reason section as well, and in the self-consciousness section, quite frankly. Action involves an antithesis, a Gegensatz, things being opposed to each other. It has its antithesis in itself, he says. So every time that you act, there's something else that's opposed to it. It's not antithesis in the sense of the old Hegelian three-step of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Put that sort of stuff out of your head, because that's not what's happening here with the reference to antithesis. Instead, when you act, the act never turns out to be exactly what you intended, because it's in a matter, it's in relation to an object that itself kind of, you might say, pushes back, presents some obstacle. Otherwise, you wouldn't act. Now, the first reference to antithesis here, saying that there is no antithesis in this, is ein nicht entgegengesetztes. So you notice there's a similarity, right? Gegengesetztes, Gegensatz, right? Those are connected. One is a adjective, one is a noun. So you might say a not antithesized in relation to the other. The entgegengesetztes, right? This is sort of an intensification, and it's saying there isn't this opposition going on within the knowing, the pure knowing. But the knowing that we're doing when we're actually acting in a real case is different than what we do in idealizations, or even you might say idle conversations about what we ought to do. So he goes on and he says the action, right, is related to a negative of consciousness, a reality possessing intrinsic being. That's the actual case and the objects that we're acting on. It's also the things within ourselves that we don't fully understand too. And he goes on and he says, contrasted with the simplicity of pure consciousness, with the absolute other or implicit manifoldness, you might say multiplicity in a certain sense, this reality, this actual case that we're dealing with, is, as he says, a plurality of circumstances, a genuine multiplicity, a Vielheit der Umstände. The Umstände are the things that are all surrounding the object or the case or something like that. A Vielheit, a multiplicity, a manyness, right? And it's, how many are in this Vielheit, this plurality? Well, way too many to count. An almost infinity. You can't specify it ahead of time. You could specify it in general, but then you get to the case, and it turns out that some parts are important and other parts aren't. So he says, this reality is a plurality of circumstances, and here's a beautiful spatial metaphor, also a temporal metaphor, which breaks up and spreads out endlessly in all directions, backwards into their conditions, Bedingungen, right? The things that help to produce the situation that you're in. Sideways into their connections. He says, ihren nebeneinander, right? How they're not just connected. He doesn't say Beziehungen, right? So Miller's translation here is a little bit, wonky. How they're arranged in relation to each other, where like you see this and then you're like, oh, that leads to this. That leads to this. This is behind this. This is behind this. Forwards into their consequences, Folgen, the things literally that follow from them. So we have here sort of a nexus. Every single case that we're dealing with that we like to look at as an abstract thing with nice, border walls is actually connected with everything else. And this is the nature of human action. Hegel is just somebody who's really attuned to seeing this, and that is part of what infects conscience, which would like everything to be nice and clean and neat, with this unconscientiousness within itself. So he says the conscientious mind is aware of this. And it knows that in the case in which it acts, it does not possess that full acquaintance with all these attendant circumstances which is required. Why not? Because it's not God, right? You'd have to know everything in order to be totally acquainted with it. And he says that its pretense of conscientiously weighing all circumstances is in vain. Now, is this a reason for despair? He says, the acquaintance with and weighing of all the circumstances are not altogether lacking, but they exist only as a moment, as something which is only for others. Isn't that an interesting twist? It's how we justify things, not just to ourselves, but to those others who we're seeking recognition from. Why did you behave this way? Why did you do this action this way? Well, because the case had these certain circumstances, and I could see that these were going to be the consequences, and these are the reasons why it came up. And then somebody can say, well, did you also check this? No, I didn't check that. We're being held accountable to others in this, right? The measure of our own conscientiousness is not solely our own feeling about it or the stories that we tell us, but also that of others, who we don't control, right? So he says, they are something which is only for others, and this incomplete knowledge is held by the conscientious mind to be sufficient and complete because it is its own knowledge. This is the danger of conscience at this point. The person who's conscientious might say, well, I don't have to be fully accountable to others. It's good enough that I can satisfy my own conscience. Now, we'll see how far that goes as we move into the next paragraphs.